Public sector career included 12 years as a member of the BART board. I was an elected official on the BART board. BART has an elected board of directors, and I ran for and won a seat in Contra Costa County. I served in leadership positions all 12 years. I served as president of the board a number of times and chair of all the committees that we had: engineering, administration, and public affairs. And I worked. My signature program when I was at BART was the BART to SFO project, which I'm very proud of. And I get to point out a little plaque. When the cop came along and insisted that his name be bigger, so I worked on that. But the other hallmark of my time at BART was that I was very proud of, that people don't cut ribbons on, is when I got to BART. For those of you who are all train buffs, I got to BART. BART had about 564 rail cars at that point, and it had one wheel truing machine. One. And that machine was really old, and it would cut and true one axle for 8 hours. Oh. And the cars were stacked up in the yard. And they couldn't put together a consist of 10-car trains. They couldn't do it. I said, well, how in the world did this happen? And the answer was, oh, well, the general manager really wants to build these extensions, Dublin, Pleasanton, Concord, Pittsburgh, and all the money's been diverted over to building. And I said, well, that's not going to work. So I launched an effort with Steve Heminger at MTC where we raised our fares and put all the money into system rehabilitation. We pulled out 150 escalators that weren't working and replaced them. We spruced up the station. BART now has 4 wheel truing machines. And I said I was going to have a ribbon cutting on wheel truing machines because politicians like to cut ribbons on new track, but not on things that actually allow things to run on the track, on a reliable basis. So my background there, I think, gave me a real appreciation for the critical role that these local and regional transportation agencies perform every single day. I was proud when we hit 350,000 trips per day on BART. They're at like 500,000. It's just amazing what they've done. And we worked in partnership with San Mateo Transit to open the line to the airport. So all told, in my 12 years, we raised about $4 billion for expansion and rehabilitation of the system. And to me, all those behind-the-scene things were very, very important. I also worked as a corporate executive at PG&E. So I sat in board meetings. I understood things about corporate governance and how Sarbanes-Oxley works and all that. So all this kind of experience sort of helped as I was parachuted into the High-Speed Rail Authority, because the first thing we had to do was basically come in and look at this as, if you will, kind of a corporate turnaround. What's the business plan? What's the organizational strengths and weaknesses? And how are we going to do this, and how are we going to restore public credibility in what we're doing? So that's all kind of a backdrop to the fundamental questions we had to ask ourselves, which is this still a good idea? Because I would have gone to the governor, as well as the other person he appointed 2 days later, Mike Rossi, who was the former vice chairman of the board of Bank of America, serves on the board of the Shorenstein Company, of Cerberus, giant hedge fund. Mike's had an amazing career in finance. So we became kind of the corporate guys, if you will, and said, all right, first question is, let's step back, first principles. Is this still a good idea for California? And, the answer is, well, yeah. Because, for one thing, we've got 38 million people now. It really doesn't matter what the slope of the curve is, but we're going to be adding more and more people at some trajectory, whether it's 20 million people in 20 years or 25 years, really sort of is immaterial. Because when you step back and think about it, basically the population of New York is going to pick up and move to California over the next quarter century. Now, I think the important thing is to try to make sure they're not actual New Yorkers. I grew up there. But I mean, we've got to deal with that. And when people say to me, well, should we build high-speed rail? I say, time out. That is not the correct question. The correct question is, how does a state that is the world's 8th largest economy sustain itself when it's going to have to deal with that kind of growth? What are we going to do? Because sitting on our backsides and doing nothing, I start to say it's not an option, but I think our friends in Washington are proving me wrong on that. But the fact of the matter is, intelligent people don't sit around and do nothing in the face of that kind of growth. And we're living off of the infrastructure that was built by an earlier generation. And that's just not sustainable. So the question becomes, where do we make our investments? How do we make investments to do this and to sustain mobility? So if you look at that, and you look at the problems that we have, we've already got congestion. We've already got the busiest air corridor. We've already got this notion that we've got population growth that's coming. And on top of that, we've decided as a society in California that we care about sustainability, that we care about air quality, that as the 8th largest economy we have a responsibility to do something about greenhouse gas emissions, that we care about transit land use, and we've passed legislation to say that. So you put all that into the cauldron in the mix, and the answer is you've got to do something. If it's not high-speed rail, it's at least 2,300 lane miles of new highway. How many lane miles of new highway did we open in the last 10 years? Not that many. It's 5 new airport runways. You know, if you're from this area, back when Dianne Feinstein was the mayor of San Francisco, they talked about expanding San Francisco Airport, adding a new runway out in the bay. You could not believe the brouhaha that created. Not going to happen. So we're not going to add runways in San Diego or here. And by the way, even if we could, you know who some of the biggest supporters of the high-speed rail program in California are? Airlines. And the reason is because Southwest doesn't really care that much anymore about riding you from Oakland to Burbank. They want to take you from Oakland to Baltimore. And so with a limited number of airport fleets, John Martin, the head of San Francisco International Airport, would rather have A380s pulling up to them than little regional jets, if you've got that kind of limitation. And this follows the model that we've seen in Europe and other places where, in fact, short haul, in the ranges that high-speed rail works, 300 miles to 500 miles, 70–80% of that is going to rail, away from air travel. Roelof van Ark, who was the former CEO of High Speed Rail Authority, told me that basically you can't really even get a flight from Paris to Brussels anymore, an airline flight. It's all rail. So in California, we actually have, despite what people say about densities and all that, we have the city pairs and we have the distances that are very well suited for high-speed rail. Can I get the next slide? So, no, I guess I already went over this, which was the history of the high-speed rail program. So we jump to the next one. So we looked at this and said, all right, we've answered the first question, which is, does this still make sense for California? Now the next question is, how should we do it? How do we do it? And by the way, one of the keys here that's really important is that around the world, and this is one of the things where we get people from the Reason Foundation, or what I call it the Beyond All Reason Foundation, and others who are anti-rail folks who love to say, oh, this stuff never pays for itself. Okay, that's bunk. That's complete bunk. And, you know, a guy who was the vice chairman of Bank of America ought to know what pays for itself and what doesn't. And he's gone through all of the numbers. And here's the reality. Virtually every place in the world that high-speed rail has been done, once the capital is expended, the ongoing operating costs pay for themselves. In a couple of cases, they're actually able to pay back some of the capital costs. Dirty little secret, we think we're going to be in that latter category, although we don't talk about it because nobody's going to believe us at this point. But we absolutely will clear the burden of the hurdle, which is in the Bond Act, that we cannot operate with an operating subsidy. We will absolutely clear that. And now the peer review group, which has previously been very critical of high-speed rail, the federal GAO, they've all said, yes, we believe that those projections are reasonable. So we looked at our first plans and we said, okay, here's the problem with it. it builds a track in the Central Valley. That's fine, but it's not enough. We need to change our plan to be different. And here's how we changed it to be different. I hope it's on the next slide. All right. So the High-Speed Rail Bond Act says you're going to build from Anaheim to San Francisco, and not just San Francisco, but to the Trans-Bay Terminal in San Francisco. The law specifies that we must make it to the Trans-Bay Terminal. We're counting on Marion to get us those last couple miles. She's going to get out her Visa card.
I'm going to need more than one Visa card.
But that's phase one of high-speed rail, is Anaheim to San Francisco. Then in the Bond Act, it said phase two is Los Angeles to San Diego. And there are historic political reasons for that. And phase two is also up to Sacramento. And this was the thing that the people at the high-speed rail program focused on for a long, long time, because the Bond Act said that's what you're building. What we decided as we revised our business plan is that's not what we're building. I mean, yeah, we're building that because the law says that, but that's necessary but not sufficient. Because why? Because that, as exciting as it may be to ride on 200, 220-mile-an-hour trains that can get you from LA to San Francisco in 2 hours and 40 minutes, fully electrified and paying for itself, as exciting as that is, it's not enough. And it's not the right vision. This is the right vision. The right vision is to look at high-speed rail not as an insular, standalone program, separate and apart from the other rail networks in the state, but instead to look at it as the backbone of an entire rail modernization program that ties into and complements and works with the existing rail networks in the state. Whether that's conventional intercity heavy rail like Amtrak or the Los Angeles Corridor, or whether it is regional rail like Caltrain or Metrolink or Altamont Corridor Express, that all of these things working together are going to have a synergistic effect. And that we're going to deliver riders to them, they're going to deliver riders to us, we can share infrastructure where possible, we can share planning, we can coordinate, and the entire experience for the rider will be better. Not only that, here's a little secret that most of you probably haven't heard. We don't actually have all $68 billion, right? You're going to have to get it kind of in chunks. And so the notion that we just build here and then wait until we can come up with some other source of money to build there and then wait is not as intelligent a program as what I think we're pursuing now, which is to say, yes, we're going to start and we're going to build a backbone structure here in the Central Valley. And I'll come back in a second to why that still makes sense. But at the same time, we're going to be working in the bookends. We're going to be making investments in the bookends to upgrade existing rail systems that will provide immediate benefits to people in those regions. And at the same time, lay the groundwork for future high-speed rail. The best example of that is our relationship with Peninsula Caltrain and JPB. Because there, what we decided was that we can meet the time requirements of Prop 1A and while using existing infrastructure for as long as possible. And what that means is that as we come up from Gilroy, instead of a brand new series of 4 tracks, which, with all due respect to those who criticized us on this, was not going to be built through Atherton. I'm sorry. Was not. And so to use the existing Caltrain alignment and Caltrain structure, the highest aspirational goal of the people on the peninsula running Caltrain for a couple of decades has been to improve that service through electrification and the addition of positive train control. Our MOU with MTC and with Peninsula Caltrain means that we're putting up $600 million from our funding base that they're matching. And so now together we are paying for what you heard from Marion Lee this morning. It is a very exciting Caltrain electrification program. Our trains will come up, they'll use that. I hear people all the time saying it is now impossible for high-speed rail to meet the time requirements of the Bond Act because they don't have their own track and because they're using the Caltrain track. These people failed geometry in high school because the speed of the train is not dependent on whether you're on a separate track or not. The speed of the train is dependent on track geometry. And if you're trying to build 4 tracks up there, new tracks, I'm sorry, you're not going to get those curves with that kind of radius and have to acquire through eminent domain that kind of land through active, dense communities to allow trains to run 200 miles an hour up there. This is not going to happen. And it doesn't happen. You don't come into Paris screaming in at 186 miles an hour up to Gare de Lyon or Gare du Nord on the high-speed rail train. These trains always slow down in the urban areas. And so it's 50 miles between San Francisco and San Jose, and basically as long as we can maintain about 120 mile an hour average to meet the time. So that stuff is just complete bunk. We are able to save billions of dollars by working in concert with the local rail agencies, and at the same time make early investments that are going to have dramatic impacts on people. Caltrain I've already talked about. We were the last piece of the funding puzzle for the Central Subway. We're the last piece of the funding puzzle for the inter-regional connector, they call it, which is the run-through tracks at Union Station in LA. They've been trying to fund that for years. Funding for that is coming from the high-speed rail program. So with that, we're able to really look at not the high-speed rail programs, but the California Rail Modernization Program. And this program, folks, the money we've leveraged, both from federal and local sources and others, is a $13 billion rail modernization program that our legislature voted on last year. So that is the different approach that we brought to this. Why don't I try the next slide? I know I'm running out of time here, and I want to leave time for questions. This just emphasizes the point that I just made. This program now is one of partnership, working with other very experienced, very successful, very popular local and regional rail systems. And, yep, we got ACE up here, too. Okay, next, please. We are building the initial segment in the Central Valley. Why are we building in the Central Valley? A bunch of reasons. I've become a total convert to this. Number one, it's the only place in the state where we don't have existing corridors. I mean, between San Francisco and San Jose, we've got the Caltrain corridor. Right now, we've got some existing corridors for at least part of our alignment in the LA Basin. There's nothing in the Central Valley except for the old UP and BNSF corridors. And, you know, one of our problems in Kings County, for example, is as we head down into Kings County south of Fresno, that BNSF line makes a left turn. And there's no way that we can, you know, possibly come close to staying in that corridor at the kind of speeds we're at. The growth in the Central Valley is enormous. It's like 4.2% a year. I was in Bakersfield, and I walked out with our staff going to a meeting, and they said, "You see over there, that's probably where our station's going to go." And I said, "There's an apartment building over there." And they said, "Yeah, it wasn't there 2 years ago. We're going to have to buy it, and we're going to have to tear it down." We need to grab right-of-way in the Central Valley, number one. Number two, it is the cheapest place to build, so to get started on high-speed rail, we can get more track mile per dollar in the Central Valley than any place else. Number three, we've got to test the trains, right? 220-mile-an-hour trains need to be tested at 250 miles an hour. That'll be real exciting between San Francisco and San Jose. Or between LA and Anaheim. So it's a great place to test the trains. All right, we got $3.3 billion in federal money. We took $2.7 billion out of our $9 billion in Prop 1A. There was another $819 million in the proposition that goes into these local systems for connectivity I talked about. And we've also agreed to spend some of our other dollars. Now, we believe that we will, at a certain point, trigger private sector investment. I told you the high-speed rail throws off operating cash. From a business standpoint, what that means, and this is the way we're going to operate this program, what that means is that we will go out to the world and say, who wants to bid for the right to operate on our infrastructure, because you'll make money if you do. So you write us a check, you put up the train sets, you collect the fares, you do the O&M, and we believe you will make a bunch of money. You write us a check for the privilege of doing that, and we will take that check and we will use it to build the next legs of the system. We believe somewhere between $12 and $20 billion will be supported by that type of private sector investment. And that doesn't even get to all the other ancillary sources of private sector dollars. Leasing our right-of-way for fiber optics and for energy facilities. This is a huge moneymaker for a lot of facilities, and this is part. Transit-oriented development monies, parking revenues, advertising. We've got a whole big hassle of things that we can do to raise private sector dollars. This is not going to be 100% taxpayer supported, not by any means. And ridership and revenue will facilitate private sector investment. I think it's the last. Okay. I'll close with this. So we're building in the Central Valley. We're building at the bookends. What's next? Next is what I think is going to be the most exciting rail program in California. And that is closing the passenger rail gap that exists in Central California south of Bakersfield. Right now, south of Bakersfield, there is one line, I think it's UP, that curly cues up over the mountains because diesels can only do about a 2% curve. It literally does a 360 at one point. It curves back over top of itself and goes up. The average speed across that for freight is about 23 miles an hour. Now, in the past, they haven't cared, but just stepping out of my high-speed rail hat for a moment and looking at this as a Californian thinking about transportation, think about it this way. 40% of America's imported goods go in and out of the ports of LA Long Beach. 40%. Panama Canal is being expanded. East Coast and Gulf Coast ports are already dredging and expanding to get ready for the Panamax tanker containers that will come through there. I think, I don't know much about maritime stuff, but I think it's a fairly significant threat to a huge piece of the California economy. So I think that improving our rail network, not just for passenger, but also for freight, means that we can enhance the efficiency of our ports. And by building a high-speed rail network through the Central Valley and over the mountains into Palmdale, we also have the opportunity to modernize some of our freight rail lines in that area, and as we head down into the Alameda Corridor and LA. So this is something that we're about to sit down and talk to the freight railroads about, because I think there's a huge opportunity here, not just to move passengers, but to enhance a freight system that I think can really help to undergird our whole economic sector there in maritime and in goods movement in and out of the valley. But we got to jump that gap from Bakersfield to Palmdale. That's about a $10 billion project. We have $4 billion of bond money left. That means we got to come up with $6 billion. It's a lot of money, and yet it's not. In the scheme of things that the state does, that the federal government does, it's not a huge amount of money, and we're starting to put together a funding plan with private dollars and other types of dollars to see how we can do that. If we get all the way to Palmdale, which could connect, if Harry Reid reinvigorates, as he's swearing he's going to do, the Las Vegas to LA or to Palmdale Desert Express, we got the beginnings of the network. We would be connected to LA Metrolink at that point. People would rocket through the valley at 200 miles an hour, get on a slower train, and start immediately pounding on politicians that they want to improve that corridor. And that's what we're looking at. And I will say, one of the things I forgot to mention is that our initial track, even though we may not be ready to run full high-speed rail service, we are able to switch the Amtrak trains from the San Joaquins, which is now the 5th busiest rail line in the country, onto our new track, where it wouldn't be sharing track with freights, and so it goes as fast as the locomotives could take it. We cut an hour at least off the 5-hour trip up and down the valley. So I've gone on and on, probably too much, but new program focused on broader rail modernization, not just high-speed rail. We've relooked at high-speed rail. We've confirmed that it's important for California and that it can meet the test sustaining itself. And we've issued the first contract. The contractor's mobilizing in Fresno, and I think you're going to see dirt flying before the end of the year. So with that, thank you very much. I'll go long, but I'm happy to take questions.
That's fine.
Yeah, let me just
Sure.
chime in first, if I may. I was with you until you got to Palmdale.
You don't like Tom?
My concern is with the blended system that it makes all the sense in the world with what's happening in the north. In the south, what's really happening? Because we hear about possibly some kind of interim terminal in Burbank. I know that railroad from my SP days between Palmdale and Burbank. And as you say, people are not going to want to get off a high-speed train or a transfer. That's the missing link as far as I can see. Could you comment on that?
Sure. First of all, I totally agree with you. Right now, my understanding is it takes about, on LA Metrolink, it takes, I think, about an hour, 50 minutes to go from Union Station up to Palmdale. And it's a Soledad Canyon, I think it's called, through there. Very windy, not very accessible. Even with dollars that we're putting in and working with LA Metropolitan Transportation Administration to improve that route, the best I'll be able to get it to is about an hour and 40 minutes, even with some double tracking and some things like that. Not very acceptable at all. We can only do what we can do, which means we're going to start in Merced and we're going to keep building south as much as we can. So I have two strategies for this. The first is the less desirable strategy, which is what I call the HS1 strategy. It was the first time I took the Eurostar from Brussels to London, and we were rocketing along and through the channel, and then we came out and we slowed way down. And we crawled through the British countryside to get to Victoria Station, and I thought, they got to do something about this. And they did. So the public push will be there, but that will take longer. Here's my real hope, and right now this is a hope, is that we get to Palmdale. Suddenly, it's no more train to nowhere. We've suddenly connected the Central Valley, the fastest growing part of the state, with the most populous region in the South. The real thing that ought to be built with the Desert Express is not Las Vegas to Palmdale. It's Las Vegas to where? LA. And so my hope is that a combination of the private sector and so forth, the way to build this is not just start in one direction and build in one direction. The way to do this is to start that, hit a tipping point, and get people interested and try to get private sector, sovereign funds, whatever, starting in LA and coming up to meet us in Palmdale. So the blended approach is very definitely an interim solution that is driven by the realities of the money that we have. It is by no means an acceptable end state. And what we're trying to do is get going with the program we have and then figure out how we're working with others to enhance this program to something that really makes more sense. I mean, the Chinese, my God, have done this. They built Nanjing to Shanghai in a year. It's 200 and some odd miles. I mean, you know, Jerry Brown came back from China and people said, what do you think? He said, I think America needs to get off its backside. So, but that, you're right, but that's how we're thinking about it at this point. Other questions?
Yes. Yeah, it's nice that you're implementing the way that the French have implemented TGV and the way Eurostar has been implemented. That's the right way to go, and it's proven. So, that's one point. But another point that is very interesting is that I talked with Professor Brownstone, who first finished the business plan evaluation data to the legislative analyst, who's John Weatherford. And I noticed that there's something odd about the information that was furnished to the legislature. And then I talked to Weatherford, and he said, "Oh, I forgot to. I just did not send the information about what high-speed rail would do to air traffic." And what was swirling in my mind is it's a slam dunk. 50 trains a day north, 50 trains a day south. With regard to amount of mode shift from airplanes to a train. Right off the bat, 50 trains. One way, 50 trains the other way. No brainer. And that information was missing.
Yeah, well, the ledge analyst, that's a whole other story.
Weatherford said it would make a lot of difference if I had that.
I'd like to ask a question, and I agree with you, but how would you work that mountainous terrain in Southern California with the freights? How do you envision that happening?
Okay, I don't want to get in trouble for saying this because I haven't talked to the freight guys yet, but our CEO, Jeff Morales, has a really interesting idea, which is we're going to be doing bridging and tunneling. I mean, if you think about going over the hatch piece from Bakersfield to Palmdale, you got to go up 4,000 or 5,000 feet, right? So the terrain is going like this, which means that with an electrically driven train, instead of 2% grade, they could take a 3.5% grade. So it's going to go like this. The terrain's going like this. It's a series of, aqueducts and tunnels, right, as you go through. And we'll be, I'm sure, using tunnel boring machines and so forth. If you're doing all that, you don't have to just do it for the passenger train. You could build a double facility for the freights. The problem is the freights would have to put freight under wire to do it. I think that they don't want to do that because what's happening in South Coast Air Quality Management District is they're getting pounded by the air regulators to replace their diesels with electric for emissions purposes. They don't want to do it. I think that's a fight they're going to lose. And so once you have to electrify in the basin, why don't you just keep those trains under wires up and over? We got to convince them that makes sense. I think it makes sense, but I'm not running a railroad, or at least not that kind of thing.
And at the same time, conventional passenger trains could...
Well, I think the problem with conventional is that if you keep to a grade that conventional diesels can use, you're now tunneling through a heck of a lot more terrain because you've got to keep the grade lower. So I think it's one or the other, but I'm sure folks in this room know more about that. Question?
A couple things. First of all, there's another rail organization that's still trying to go through the I-5 corridor and abandon Palmdale entirely. Is that a
non-starter?
That's a non-starter.
It's non-starter for two reasons. One's legal and one is policy. The legal reason is that the Bond Act makes very specific the cities that we're supposed to serve. That includes Palmdale, includes Bakersfield, includes Braymer. The practical reason, I've had this argument with my environmental friends, everybody else say, oh, it'd be a lot less grief if you just went up the I-5. Yeah, it would. And, for Californians in this room, let me just say something. I've lived in this state for 35 years. And the great thing about this high-speed rail authority assignment that I've had from Governor Brown is that I've learned much more about California than I ever knew. And here's the most important thing that I've learned in the last 2 years. This state is not divided north and south. That's all baloney. This is not about the Dodgers versus the Giants. This is about coastal California versus inland California. On the coast, we have more wealth, better environment, more jobs, more educational institutions, more opportunity, just all of that. Inland, what people don't realize, 5 of the 10 poorest counties in the United States of America are in the Central Valley of California. It is Appalachia west of the Mississippi that people refer to it that way. Poverty rate there is astonishing. We need to connect our state to provide opportunities. And the other thing, too, is it's crazy. If we go up I-5, pretty soon somebody's going to say, well, you've got to put a lateral across to Fresno. You've got to put a lateral across to Bakersfield. Now what have you done? You've torn up more farmland. You've got less operational common sense. So the whole thing is one of those things that looks good until you spend a little time thinking about it.
Well, I wasn't thinking so much of the Central Valley as leaping over the mountains. That the
Ruloff
grapevine is easier than Palmdale and Tehachapi.
It actually turned out not to be true. Ruloff Van Ark, who has built a lot of high-speed rail systems around the world, when he was the CEO, had the authority to look at going over the grapevine instead of over to Palmdale. Seismic issues are atrocious. It's really bad. You end up really not saving any money. And then politically, there's this little problem that there are big land-holding operations there, including Cajon Ranch, which is adamantly opposed to that route. And the NRDC had already reached an agreement with Cajon Ranch on an environmental preserve there, and we'd have to knife right through that. So you don't save any money, you take on some big enemies. And we looked at that and just said it didn't make sense.
On that Palmdale to Bakersfield section, are you envisioning separate rail for freight versus passenger?
Right at the moment, all we're trying to do is get our passenger rail done. What we're saying is we'd like to reach out to the freights and say, while we're building this $10 billion thing across there, it might make sense to kind of work together on this to see if they're, they would have to be separated. We can't run 200-mile-an-hour trains on the same track that freight's running. Right, but the point is, if you're building a tunnel, it's not going to cost twice as much to have one tunnel for freight and one tunnel for rail as it would to do it separate.
So it's a means of sharing the funding to both benefits.
That's exactly right. And again, this is our idea. The freights may look at this and say, yeah. Sir.
Yes. You mentioned something dealing with Harry Reid.
Yeah.
I guess it's your utopian plan of everything works out great.
That's a fair word to use. I can't say I like it.
Yeah. My question is this: how important is that outside, unpredictable entity in getting what you need so far as the outcome goes? Is very simple.
That's a great question, and here my answer to it very quickly is this. At the moment, right now, we sort of feel like we're on our own. We have our federal partners at the Federal Railroad Administration and DOT, but we're not going to get any more federal appropriations for the next couple of years. We know that. So we are looking at this as something that we're doing on our own. We think that at a certain point, we can go in, and again, this may be utopian, it may be Pollyanna, but the difference is, if we can put most of this together ourselves, we think we can then trigger something that can bring this other stuff in. We're not waiting for the capital to come over the hill. But I could see, for example, right now, Congressman Kevin McCarthy, who's, I started saying in the leadership, I don't know if there is such a thing, he's like, I hate high-speed rail, I'm against high-speed rail. But if we go to him and we say, look, we know you're against high-speed rail, we don't care. We need $10 billion. Okay, we got $4 billion from our bonds. We got $2 billion from this. We got another $1 billion from leasing right-of-way revenues and so forth. We're $800 million short, Congressman, to connect the people in your community with Los Angeles. Will you help us? It's a different conversation than saying we need $68 billion. How much federal money can you give us in this Tea Party era? And so we're on our own, but we're going to try to leverage what we got to see what else we can get. Sir?
Yes, how much do you expect the present lawsuits to hinder the start of construction?
Lawsuits, the interesting thing is when I never had any idea of this, but I read in the Chronicle on the 75th anniversary of the Golden Gate Bridge, there were 2,000 lawsuits against the Golden Gate Bridge. Stop its construction. Wow. So we're doing better than that. Right now we have...
It's mostly Atherton.
Right now
Atherton cause.
we have 3. One is an appeal from a case that we won on our environmental work brought by the city of Atherton, and we think we'll win that on appeal. The second one is an attack on the bonds, the validity of the bonds. The state has never lost a case attacking the validity of the bonds ever, and so we expect to win that one. And the third one is a lawsuit brought by Kings County, and that one is a little tougher to predict. we had a ruling from the judge that kind of slapped us around a little bit and said, you guys, your first business plan didn't meet the statutory standards. But I was talking here about our second business plan, which was much more focused on the usability of the system, and the legislature voted based on our second plan, and the judge respected that vote. So even though it was an embarrassing decision for us to be told that we'd abused our discretion, which I had to point out to reporters is not the same as abusing small kittens, we ended up, the judge letting us go forward. We don't think that this litigation will, in fact, stop us. We've not done a formal groundbreaking because we want to let the litigation situation clear. We hope that that'll be done by January. But meanwhile, the contractor has opened his office in Fresno, and he's been given his first notice to proceed. We're kind of moving. Sir?
Has there been any consideration of doing any fast overnight package service between the Bay Area and LA once the line is in service to supplement the revenue, partnering with someone like FedEx, UPS, or someone like that?
I think the answer to your question is at this point, no. This organization is still building up to be at a place where it can deliver a $6 billion project, so we're sort of focused on doing that and getting the organizational things right. As we get closer to operations, I suspect there'll be all kinds of things like that that we can consider. But again, for right now, rather than get into protracted negotiations with those guys, we just got to focus on getting the first piece built. And I'll just end with this. Among the many responsibilities we have is another kind of more hard to describe sense of responsibility. We are basically at this point all that's left of President Obama's vision of a nationwide high-speed rail network. It's here. It's nowhere else, which is why DOT has gotten in some trouble for trying to call things like the upgrade from Chicago to St. Louis, high-speed rail, when it's really moving 110 miles an hour. And that's great, but I mean, it's not what we think of as international standards of high-speed rail. We're it. If we screw this up, we will set back the cause of high-speed rail in this country for decades. And the collateral damage from that will affect other passenger rail as well. At a time when the public's support for passenger rail is expanding by leaps and bounds. So we're going to eat our peas and vegetables and get this right, because we really can't afford to screw it up, either in terms of the legacy that we leave for this governor, who I think is doing a great job for the state, and has stuck his neck out on this as an act of political courage that you don't see much anymore. As well as doing something for our kids and their kids. So we're very serious about this. I know I can be kind of lighthearted and comedic sometimes, but I got to tell you, the entire team there working on this wants to make this thing happen. Thank you very much.
Okay, folks, that was terrific. And I really appreciate your candor, Mr. Chairman. We exercised also about